Friends, today's story will send chills down your spine. A cruel father used to inject his own daughter, but those injections were no ordinary medicine. He used them to make his daughter grow up unnaturally fast. By the age of 14, the girl had matured so much that people in the neighborhood would stare in shock. Her height was already normal, but due to her father's greed and cruelty, she underwent abnormal physical changes for her age. But that's not all. When the girl fully matured, her heartless father turned her into a means of earning money. That lazy and ruthless man, for his own selfish gains, left her in a horrifying situation that will make your skin crawl. What did that monstrous father do, and what was his fate? If you want to know this heartbreaking true story, make sure to watch till the end. If the story leaves an impact on you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. So let's begin. A harsh winter night blanketed the city in silence, broken only by the occasional gusts of wind that rattled the window panes. Inside the dimly lit corridor of Steve Memorial Hospital, the air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptics, and the faint murmur of hurried footsteps echoed through the halls. Steve sat on a cold metal bench, his head resting in his trembling hands. His heart pounded erratically, and his fingers twitched with nervous energy. His wife was inside the emergency room fighting for her life while he sat there, powerless, waiting for a fate he had no control over. Every second felt like an eternity. The walls around him felt like they were closing in, suffocating him with their unbearable stillness. Then suddenly, the door to the emergency ward swung open. A nurse emerged, her white uniform crisp and untainted, yet her expression carried the weight of the news she was about to deliver. Steve stood up so fast that the blood rushed to his head. He looked at the nurse, desperate for any sign of hope. "I'm sorry," the nurse said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did everything we could, but we couldn't save her." The words hit him like a physical blow. His legs wobbled, and he stumbled back against the wall. A sharp ringing filled his ears, drowning out every other sound around him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, it felt like his own life was slipping away. His wife was gone, the woman he had loved, the woman who had been his companion through years of struggle, the woman who had carried their child for 9 months, was now nothing more than a body lying still behind those doors. The world tilted, his vision blurred, and an overwhelming wave of grief and rage surged through him. His fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. Then, through his blurred vision, he noticed the nurse was still standing there, but now she was holding something, a small, delicate bundle wrapped in a soft white cloth. "This is your daughter," she said gently, stepping forward. For a long moment, Steve just stared. A baby. His child. The very thing that had taken his wife away from him. The nurse extended the baby toward him, but Steve didn't move. His hands, which had always been strong from years of hard labor, now felt like they weighed a ton. Finally, he forced himself to reach out. His fingers trembled as he took the tiny infant into his arms. She was so small, so light, her skin still pinkish, her tiny fingers curled into delicate fists. She let out a soft whimper, barely audible. Something inside him shattered. A deep, broken sob tore through his chest, and he collapsed onto the bench, cradling the child close to him. His shoulders shook, and for the first time in years, Steve cried. The hospital walls bore witness to the raw agony of a man who had just lost his wife and gained a daughter in the same breath. Tears streamed down his face as he rocked back and forth, his mind spinning in turmoil. How will I raise this child alone? How will I take care of her without her mother? Why did fate take my wife away and leave me with this burden? A wave of bitterness surged through him, tightening his chest. He bit his lip, trying to drown out the cruel thoughts whispering in his mind. A soft hand rested on his shoulder. He turned to see his elder sister standing there, her face unreadable. "Let's go," she said quietly. We need to take your wife home for the burial. Steve swallowed hard and nodded. He handed the baby to his sister and stood up, his body feeling heavier than ever. I leave her in your care, he whispered, his voice barely audible. She has no mother, and I don't know how to raise her. His sister barely glanced at the infant before abruptly pushing her back toward him. Take her yourself, she snapped, stepping back as if the baby carried a curse. She's the reason your wife is dead. She's a bad omen. Steve stared at her, stunned. She killed her own mother the moment she was born. Who knows what kind of misfortune she'll bring in the future, his sister added coldly. A surge of anger and pain rushed through Steve's chest. He wanted to scream at his sister, to tell her how heartless she was, but the words never came. Instead, he turned away and walked out of the hospital, his newborn daughter still in his arms. The funeral was a blur, the scent of damp earth, the distant wails of mourners, the hollow prayers. None of it felt real. It was as if he was watching it all happen to someone else. After it was over, as the last handful of soil was thrown onto his wife's grave, Steve felt nothing but emptiness. A name. His daughter needed a name. He called her Arzu, meaning hope. But in his heart, there was none. Steve had no desire to raise a child. He didn't know how to love her. He didn't even know if he wanted her. So he did what seemed easiest. He sent her away. His wife's mother, an elderly woman living alone, agreed to take the baby in. She was the only one who welcomed Arzu with open arms. As for Steve, he shut himself off from the world. His home became a tomb of silence and sorrow. Every evening, he returned from the medical store where he worked only to drink himself into oblivion, drowning in thoughts he couldn't escape. If this child had never been born, my wife would still be alive. She's the reason my life is ruined. These thoughts consumed him, day after day, night after night. Years passed. Steve became an alcoholic, his job hanging by a thread, his existence nothing more than a meaningless cycle of drinking, sleeping, and blaming the daughter he had abandoned. The years had passed in silence, but Steve had never truly lived any of them. His life had become a cycle of emptiness drowned in the bitter taste of alcohol. He never visited his daughter, never checked on her, never cared to know how she was growing up. As far as he was concerned, she did not exist. But fate had other plans. One cold evening, a knock echoed through his tiny, cluttered house. Steve groaned, rubbing his temples, his head throbbing from the previous night's drinking. The knocking grew louder. Irritated, he stumbled toward the door and swung it open. A bitter wind swept in, and standing there was an old woman wrapped in a tattered shawl. Her face was weathered with time, her eyes holding an expression he couldn't quite read. But the moment she opened her mouth, his heart sank. She's gone. It took him a moment to understand. His mother-in-law had passed away. Before he could react, the woman stepped aside, revealing a girl, thin and shivering, clutching a small bundle of clothes. Arzu. The last time he had seen her, she was a helpless infant crying in his arms. Now, she stood before him, a fragile girl of 13. Her face held a quiet sadness, a hesitance in her eyes, as if she wasn't sure whether she was truly welcome. "Baba," she whispered. Steve felt nothing. No warmth, no love, only the same resentment that had festered inside him for years. He turned away without a word, leaving the door open behind him. The old woman sighed. She has nowhere else to go. Steve didn't answer. He simply walked back to his chair and sat down, staring at the wall. That night, Arzu stepped into a home that had no love for her. The house was filthy and suffocating, thick with the stench of stale alcohol. Dust covered the furniture, and empty bottles cluttered every corner. The air inside felt heavy, filled with an unspoken tension. Arzu carefully set her small bag down and looked around. This was supposed to be her home, but it didn't feel like one. She tried to make herself useful, cleaning the kitchen, sweeping the floor, washing the dishes. She wanted to be acknowledged, to be seen. But Steve never once looked at her. He barely spoke, barely acknowledged her presence. At night, he sat in the corner, drinking himself into a numb stupor, muttering things she wasn't meant to hear. If she wasn't born, my wife would still be alive. This girl ruined everything. Arzu never replied, but each word cut her like a blade. She was only 13, but she had already learned not to expect kindness from her father. Still, she tried. She took care of the house, cooked what little food they had, and tried to make things easier for him. But Steve was a man who had stopped caring long ago. His work at the medical store had ended years ago. He no longer had a job, no longer had a source of income. Instead, he spent his time gambling with the neighborhood men, hoping for a stroke of luck that never came. Their money ran out. Their food ran out. One evening, after yet another day of hunger, Arzu gathered the courage to speak. "Baba," she said softly, standing near his chair, "there's no food left." Steve didn't respond. She hesitated before continuing, "If you don't go to work, how will we eat?" His bloodshot eyes snapped open. He stared at her, his gaze filled with something dark and unreadable. "What do you expect me to do?" he slurred. "Work, Baba," she said simply. "Please." Steve let out a dry, bitter laugh. He sat up slowly, rubbing his forehead. "You sound just like your mother," he muttered. "Always nagging, always asking me to do something." Arzu lowered her gaze. She knew pushing him further would be useless. She didn't know that her father had already started thinking of another way to solve his problems. Winter came. One night, a fever gripped Arzu's frail body. Her skin burned, and her limbs ached as she curled up in her thin blanket, shivering uncontrollably. Struggling to stay upright, she dragged herself to her father's room. "Baba, I don't feel well." Steve barely looked at her at first, but when he did, his gaze lingered. For the first time, he truly observed her. She was only 13, yet something about her seemed older. Her body had started to change, maturing beyond her years. A twisted idea took root in his mind. "You don't need to worry, Arzu," he said, forcing a smile. "I'll bring you medicine." That night, for the first time in years, Steve left the house with purpose. But he didn't go looking for fever medicine. Instead, he went back to the medical store where he had once worked. The pharmacist frowned as he saw him. "You don't work here anymore, Steve." "I just need something for my daughter's fever," Steve replied smoothly. The pharmacist sighed and reached for a basic fever injection. But Steve's eyes wandered elsewhere, toward a particular vial sitting on the upper shelf. He remembered that drug. It was an illegal growth stimulant, designed to accelerate puberty and enhance physical maturity. He had overheard corrupt doctors discussing its use in underground circles, where innocence was stolen for profit. His fingers trembled with excitement as he reached for it. This was what he needed. That night, when he returned home, Arzu was barely awake, her body weak and feverish. Steve sat beside her, the syringe hidden in his hand. "Don't worry," he said soothingly. "This will make you feel better." Too exhausted to argue, Arzu closed her eyes. The needle pierced her skin. A warm sensation spread through her body, and within moments, the fever vanished. She fell asleep instantly, unaware of what had truly just happened. Steve smirked in satisfaction. His plan had begun, and he was just getting started. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Arzu noticed strange changes in her body, but she was too young to understand what was happening. She was only 14, yet she felt different. Her limbs grew heavier, her skin smoother, her face sharper. She would often find herself staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror, wondering why she looked so much older than the girls her age. The fever that had once kept her weak had disappeared. But in its place, something else was happening. She felt her father's eyes on her more often now, not in the way a parent looks at a child, but with something she couldn't quite name. Steve continued giving her the injections. Each time she fell sick, which was every week now, he would bring the same syringe, promising it would make her feel better. Arzu trusted him. She never questioned why he smiled so strangely as he pressed the needle into her skin. One afternoon, as she was fetching water from the neighbor's house, she overheard a conversation. "Have you noticed how Arzu looks?" It was the old woman from next door, speaking to another lady. "She's only 14, but she looks like a grown woman. It's unnatural." The other woman scoffed. "Steve doesn't even feed her properly, yet she's growing like this. Something is wrong." Arzu's hands trembled as she held the water pot. They were talking about her. She hurried back home, but their voices echoed in her head. That night, she sat in the corner watching her father. He was drinking as always, his head lolling to one side. "Baba," Arzu called. Steve grunted in response. "Why do I get sick so often?" she asked. He chuckled, his eyes lazy from intoxication. "It happens, Arzu. You're weak. But don't worry, I'll always take care of you." Arzu didn't say anything else, but for the first time, she felt uneasy. One evening, Steve came home earlier than usual. "Arzu, make something special for dinner tonight," he said, slurring slightly. "We have a guest coming." Arzu frowned. "Who?" "You know him," Steve said with a smile. "He used to visit when you were little." That night, as she set the table, a knock came at the door. Steve opened it, and a large, heavyset man stepped inside. His face was weathered, his eyes small and beady, and he smelled of expensive cologne. The man's gaze landed on Arzu. She froze. Steve smirked. Arzu looked up at the man and saw something, hunger-like in his eyes. "Javed," Steve said, slapping the man on the back. "You remember her, don't you?" Javed chuckled, not taking his eyes off her. "Of course. But she was just a child back then. How has she grown so much?" Arzu's heart pounded. Steve waved a dismissive hand. "She's healthy. Some girls mature early." Javed's lips curled. "Very early, it seems." Arzu clenched her fists under the table. Something was terribly wrong. Dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. Javed watched her the entire time, and Steve didn't stop him. After the meal, Javed leaned back, rubbing his belly. "Steve, I think I'll stay the night." Steve hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course, brother. But I have to go out for some urgent work." Arzu felt a chill run down her spine. Her father was leaving her alone with this man. She didn't know why, but her entire body screamed at her to run. She stood up quickly. "Buba, I don't feel well. I think I'll go to sleep early." Javed smiled. "Go ahead, Arzu. I'll see you in the morning." His voice sent a shiver down her spine. Arzu locked her door that night. She sat in the darkness, her breathing uneven. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing. Her father had sold her, and this was just the beginning. Arzu sat in her darkened room, her heart pounding like a war drum inside her chest. Every fiber of her being screamed that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Outside, she could hear the muffled laughter of her father and Javed, their voices thick with drink. The sound of glasses clinking together. the low murmur of a conversation she couldn't quite make out. Then, suddenly, silence. Arzu held her breath. A few moments passed. Then, footsteps. Slow. Measured. Coming toward her door. She sprang to her feet, pressing herself against the cold wall. The handle of her door rattled. Once. Twice. A low chuckle. Arzu. Javad's voice slithered through the cracks like poison. Your Buba told me to take care of you tonight. A sharp stab of terror shot through her body. Her father had left her for this. Javad tried the handle again. This time, he pushed harder. Arzu lunged for the window. It was small, barely big enough for her to squeeze through, but she didn't care. She clawed at the wooden frame, yanking it open just as she heard the loud crash of the door being kicked in. A burst of adrenaline shot through her veins. She leapt through the window. Her feet hit the cold ground outside, and she ran. She ran like she had never run before. Behind her, she heard Javad shout, "Come back!" But she didn't stop. The streets were dark and empty, her bare feet slapping against the frozen dirt. She had no idea where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. She ran for what felt like hours. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't dare stop. She didn't dare look back. Finally, she saw a house she recognized. It was her maternal aunt's home. She reached the door and pounded on it with all her strength. For a few moments, there was nothing. Then, the door swung open. Her maternal aunt stood there, eyes widening in shock at the sight of Arzu. Barefoot, disheveled, her face streaked with tears. Arzu collapsed into her arms, her body trembling as the words poured out of her. Baba sold me. He gave me to a man, she sobbed. Her maternal aunt's grip tightened. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she gently stroked Arzu's hair. You're safe now, she whispered. But in her eyes, a storm was brewing. The next morning, Arzu woke up in a warm bed. It felt strange. For years, she had been used to sleeping in the cold, in a house that never felt like home. But here, she felt safe. Her maternal aunt entered the room and sat beside her. Arzu, she hesitated. We have to do something about your father. Arzu swallowed hard. She had always wanted her father's love. She had spent her whole life trying to earn it. But now, she knew the truth. Her father didn't see her as a daughter. She was nothing more than a way to make money. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Okay, she said softly. Her maternal aunt's son, a young man named Imran, stepped into the room. He had been listening. I'll handle it, he said. And he did. By the end of the day, the police were knocking on Steve's door. He was sitting in his usual spot, nursing a drink, when the heavy pounding shook him from his stupor. He frowned, staggering toward the door. When he opened it, he was face to face with two officers. Steve, one of them said coldly, you are under arrest. Steve's mind reeled. What? Why? The officer's eyes darkened. For attempting to sell your daughter. The words hit him like a slap. But before he could protest, the cuffs were on his wrists. He was dragged outside, his neighbors watching in silence. Jared had already been arrested earlier that morning. As Steve was shoved into the police van, he saw a familiar figure standing across the street, Arzu. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. For the first time in years, Steve felt something, fear. Not for himself, but for what he had done. For the first time, he realized, his daughter was no longer his victim. She was free. And he was nothing. Years passed. Arzu never saw her father again. She built a life for herself, far away from the place that had once been her prison. She never forgot what had happened, but she survived. She became stronger, wiser, and she never looked back. Friends, this story is not just a tale. It is a harsh reality of society. A daughter, bound by blood, became the victim of her own father's greed, inhumanity, and cruelty. But in the end, justice was served, and that monstrous father faced the consequences of his actions. This incident teaches us that no innocent person should ever fall victim to injustice and cruelty. We must stand up against wrongdoing around us and support those in need. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that more important stories can reach you in the future. We'll return with another real-life story. Until then, stay healthy and stay well.